The train's whistle pierced through the morning mist like a cry from the past, its mournful sound echoing across the valley that Marcus had not seen in 27 years. As the locomotive slowed to a crawl, approaching the weathered platform of Millbrook Station, his hands trembled against the cool window glass. The reflection staring back at him was that of a stranger, silver threading through once dark hair, lines etched deep around eyes that had seen too much, a jaw set with the kind of determination that comes only from years of planning, waiting and remembering. The town spread before him like a faded photograph, smaller than his memories had painted it, yet every building, every street corner, every weather vane seemed to whisper secrets he'd tried so hard to forget. The Blackwood mansion still dominated the hillside, its Gothic spires reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers, its dark stone walls as imposing as ever. Even from this distance, Marcus could feel its presence, a shadow that had loomed over his entire life. "Last stop, Millbrook," the conductor called out, his voice carrying the worn familiarity of someone who'd been making this announcement for decades. Marcus rose slowly from his seat, his tailored coat and polished shoes marking him as an outsider now, though every fiber of his being knew this place intimately. He gathered his single leather suitcase, he wouldn't be staying long, and stepped onto the platform where his nightmare had begun so many years ago. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and something else, something that made his chest tighten with memory. It was the smell of the old paper mill, the one his father had worked at until the day everything changed. The mill was gone now. He could see that much from where he stood, replaced by what looked like a shopping center bearing the Blackwood name in gleaming brass letters. Even in absence, they had marked their territory. "Marcus? Marcus Thorne." The voice made him turn, and for a moment, the years collapsed like a house of cards. Standing before him was Sarah Chen, though she was Sarah Martinez now, according to the wedding ring on her finger. Her dark hair was shorter, touched with early gray, and her eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there when they were 17 and foolishly in love. Sarah. Her name felt foreign on his tongue, like a word from a language he'd once known but had forgotten how to speak. No one expected you to come back." Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, sharp as the autumn wind. "Especially not now. Especially not after what happened to your father." The mention of his father hit him like a physical blow, but Marcus had learned long ago to hide his pain behind a mask of composure. "I heard about the memorial service. A little late, don't you think?" 27 years late. Sarah's expression softened slightly. And for a moment, he caught a glimpse of the girl he'd once known, the one who used to meet him by the old oak tree behind the school, the one who had promised they'd leave this town together and never look back. "Marcus, you have to understand, people were scared. After your father died, after what Cornelius Blackwood said about the embezzlement." "What he said?" Marcus's voice was deadly quiet. "You mean what he lied about?" The space between them grew thick with unspoken words, with memories too painful to examine in the harsh light of day. Sarah glanced around the empty platform nervously, as if the very walls had ears that reported back to the mansion on the hill. "We can't talk here," she whispered urgently. "If you're really back, if you're really going to—" She stopped herself. But Marcus could read the fear in her eyes, the same fear he'd seen in everyone's faces the day he'd left this town, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of rage. "Meet me at the old cemetery tonight," he said quietly. "By my father's grave. If you want answers, if you want to know why I'm really here." Sarah nodded, her face pale in the morning light. "Marcus, please be careful. The Blackwoods aren't the same family you left behind. Cornelius is dead, but his son Damien, he's worse. Much worse. And he has power now, real power, the kind that can make people disappear." With those chilling words hanging between them, Sarah hurried away, her footsteps echoing on the old wooden platform until she was swallowed by the morning mist. Marcus stood alone for a long moment, letting the weight of his return settle over him like a familiar coat. He had known this wouldn't be easy, had known that coming back would open old wounds that had never properly healed. But he also knew that some debts could only be paid in full, and the Blackwood family owed him more than money. They owed him a life. The walk through town was like moving through a museum of his own childhood. Each street corner a monument to memories he'd tried so hard to bury. There was Peterson's drugstore, where he'd bought candy with the few coins his father could spare. There was the barber shop, where old Mr. Kowalski used to tell stories of the old country while trimming hair for a quarter. The school where he'd first met Sarah, where he'd dreamed of a future that seemed as bright as the morning sun. But for every familiar sight that tugged at his heartstrings, there was a reminder of the Blackwood influence. Their name was everywhere now, on banks, on restaurants, on the new community center that had been built where the old library used to stand. They had bought this town, brick by brick, soul by soul, until it was less a community than a company town with their name on the letterhead. Marcus made his way to the Millbrook Inn, a modest establishment that had somehow managed to survive the Blackwood expansion. The elderly proprietor, a woman whose weathered face spoke of decades spent in this small town, looked up from her ledger as he approached the front desk. "I'd like a room," Marcus said simply, setting his suitcase down on the worn carpet. The woman studied him with sharp eyes, the kind that had seen enough to know when someone was carrying secrets. "You're not from around here," she said, though it wasn't quite a question. "I used to be. A long time ago." Something in his voice must have stirred a memory, because her expression changed, her eyes widening with recognition. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "You're little Marcus Thorne." Eddie's boy. The use of his father's name sent a jolt through him. Eddie Thorne, a good man, an honest man, a man who had worked himself to the bone trying to provide for his family until the day Cornelius Blackwood had accused him of embezzling from the mill's pension fund. The accusations had been false, completely fabricated, but by the time the truth might have emerged, Eddie Thorne was dead, found hanging in his garage with a note that everyone said was a confession, but that Marcus knew was a forgery. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said, recognizing her now despite the years. She had been friends with his mother, back when his mother was still alive, back when they'd still had hope. "I heard you'd made something of yourself in the city," she said quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the registration book. "Business, wasn't it? Something with computers?" "Something like that." Marcus didn't elaborate. The truth was that he'd built a software empire, had become the kind of wealthy that the old Marcus could never have imagined. But money was just a tool, and he'd spent the last decade acquiring the kind of resources that would be necessary for what he'd come here to do. Mrs. Patterson handed him a key, room 7 on the 2nd floor. "Marcus," she said as he turned to leave, "whatever you're thinking of doing, whatever brought you back here, be careful. The Blackwoods have long memories and they don't forgive." "Neither do I," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. His room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the main street. From here, he could see the entire downtown area, could watch the people of Millbrook going about their daily lives, most of them probably unaware that their town was built on a foundation of lies and corruption. Marcus set his suitcase on the bed and pulled out the manila folder that had traveled with him across the country. The folder that contained 27 years of research, investigation, and carefully gathered evidence. The top photograph was of his father, taken just a few months before his death. Eddie Thorne had been a handsome man, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, the sort of person who believed that if you worked hard and treated people fairly, life would work out in the end. Marcus traced his finger along the edge of the photo, remembering the sound of his father's laugh, the way he used to ruffle Marcus's hair when he came home from the mill, the pride in his voice when Marcus brought home good grades from school. The next photograph was of Cornelius Blackwood, the family patriarch who had orchestrated his father's destruction. Even in the black and white image, Cornelius looked like a man who was used to getting his way, his pale eyes cold and calculating. His mouth set in what might have been a smile but looked more like a predator baring his teeth. This man had destroyed the Thorne family with the same casual indifference that someone might swat a fly, and he had gotten away with it for decades. But Cornelius was dead now. Had been for 3 years, according to Marcus's research. The empire had passed to his son Damien, a man who made his father look like a choir boy. where Cornelius had been content to control Millbrook through economic manipulation and political pressure, Damien had expanded the family's influence through methods that were decidedly more direct and infinitely more ruthless. Marcus spent the afternoon walking through town, reacquainting himself with streets that had once been as familiar as his own heartbeat. He visited the site where his childhood home had stood, now a parking lot for a Blackwood-owned restaurant. He walked past the cemetery where his father was buried, noting the location for his meeting with Sarah later that evening. He even drove past the mansion on the hill, studying its approaches, its security measures, its vulnerabilities. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Marcus made his way to the cemetery. The old iron gates stood open, and he walked among the weathered headstones until he found what he was looking for. The grave was modest, marked only by a simple stone that read Edward James Thorne, beloved father and husband. Someone had left fresh flowers, which surprised him until he heard soft footsteps on the gravel path behind him. "I come here sometimes," Sarah said quietly, moving to stand beside him, "to remember what this town used to be like, before the Blackwoods owned everything and everyone." Marcus knelt and touched the cold stone, feeling the weight of 27 years pressing down on his shoulders. "He didn't do it, Sarah. He never stole a penny from anyone." "I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "We all knew even then, but knowing and being able to prove it are different things, and the Blackwoods made sure that anyone who might have spoken up had reasons to stay quiet." "What reasons?" Marcus stood, turning to face her in the gathering twilight. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight filtering through the old oak trees. "My father owned a small construction company. After your dad died, after you left town, Cornelius came to him with an offer. Partner with Blackwood Industries, and there would be plenty of work for everyone. Refuse and, well," she gestured helplessly. 3 other contractors in town refused. All 3 lost their businesses within a year. One lost his house. Another lost his marriage when the stress became too much. And your father? Took the deal, like everyone else. There was shame in her voice, but also a tired acceptance. That's how they do it, Marcus. They don't just buy your loyalty. They buy your silence by making sure you have too much to lose if you speak up. Marcus felt the familiar anger rising in his chest. The same rage that had sustained him through years of exile, through nights when he'd wake up screaming his father's name, through the slow, methodical process of building the resources he would need to come back here and set things right. "Tell me about Damien," he said. Sarah's face went pale. "He's not like his father. Cornelius was calculating, patient. He would destroy you slowly, methodically, in ways that looked like business decisions or unfortunate coincidences. Damien is different, more direct. 3 years ago, a reporter from the state newspaper started asking questions about some of the family's business practices. They found him in his hotel room 2 weeks later. Heart attack, the coroner said, but the reporter was 28 years old and in perfect health. "You think—" "I don't think anything," Sarah said quickly. I don't ask questions, and I don't talk about the Blackwoods. Not usually. But when I saw you on that platform this morning..." She turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Marcus, I loved you once. We had plans, remember? We were going to leave this town together, go to college, build a life somewhere the Blackwood name didn't matter. But then your father died and you disappeared and I..." "You what?" His voice was gentler now, remembering the girl he'd once planned to marry, the future they'd dreamed of together. "I waited," she whispered. "For 2 years I waited for you to come back, to write, to call, something. But you never did. And eventually I had to accept that the boy I loved was gone, probably forever. So I married Tom Martinez, had 2 kids, and tried to build a life in the shadow of the people who destroyed the only future I ever wanted." The pain in her voice was like a knife to his heart. Marcus had thought he was the only victim of the Blackwood family's cruelty. But looking at Sarah now, he realized that their poison had spread far beyond his own life, had touched everyone who had cared about him, everyone who had been brave enough to believe in something better. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "I should have written, should have called, but I was so angry, so focused on revenge," Sarah finished for him. That's why you're here, isn't it? That's what this is about. Marcus nodded, seeing no point in lying to her. They destroyed my family, Sarah. They killed my father as surely as if they'd put a gun to his head. And they got away with it. For 27 years, they've gotten away with it. And you think you can change that? You think you can come back here and somehow make them pay? Sarah's voice was rising, fear and frustration bleeding through her carefully controlled composure. Marcus, they own this town. They own the police, the mayor, the judges. They have lawyers and accountants and security people who make problems disappear. What do you have? Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive, no bigger than his thumb. I have the truth. I have bank records, correspondence, testimony from people who were there when it happened. I have evidence that Cornelius Blackwood framed my father. And I have proof that the current family business is built on a foundation of fraud, tax evasion, and worse. Sarah stared at the small device in his palm. How did you get all of that? Money opens doors, Sarah. Enough money opens any door. I've spent the last 10 years paying investigators, hackers, former employees with grudges. I've bought testimony, stolen documents, and compiled enough evidence to bring down the entire family. Marcus's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a plan that had consumed the better part of his adult life. And then what? Sarah asked. Let's say you succeed. Let's say you somehow manage to destroy the Blackwoods. What happens to the rest of us? What happens to this town? They employ half the people in Millbrook. Their money keeps the schools running, the hospitals open. If they go down, they'll take everyone else with them. It was a question Marcus had wrestled with for years, the moral complexity that made his quest for revenge less satisfying than it should have been. He had no desire to hurt innocent people, but he also couldn't let his father's killers continue to prosper while Eddie Thorne molded in his grave. I've thought about that, he said finally. The evidence I've gathered doesn't just prove their crimes, it also reveals where they've hidden their assets. Money that was stolen from pension funds, from government contracts, from a dozen different sources over the years. When this is over, when they're brought to justice, that money can be returned to the people and institutions it was stolen from. This town doesn't need the Blackwoods. It needs the resources they've stolen. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Finally, she sighed and shook her head. You always were the smartest person in our class. But Marcus, smart doesn't always win. Sometimes the bad guys have too much power, too much influence. Sometimes the system is so rigged that even the truth isn't enough. Then I guess we'll find out which kind of world we're living in, Marcus replied. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of car engines echoed through the cemetery, growing louder as they approached. Marcus counted at least 3 vehicles, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness like searchlights. Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his jacket. We have to go, she whispered urgently. Now, but it was too late. The cars had already surrounded the cemetery, their occupants emerging into the night like shadows given form. Marcus recognized the tall figure in the center immediately, even though he'd only seen him in photographs. Damien Blackwood was a younger version of his father, but where Cornelius had cultivated an image of respectability, Damien made no effort to hide what he was. His expensive suit couldn't disguise the predator underneath, and his pale eyes held the kind of cold intelligence that Marcus recognized from his own mirror. Marcus Thorne, Damien said, his voice carrying easily through the still night air. The prodigal son returns. I have to admit, I'm impressed. 27 years is a long time to nurse a grudge. Marcus stepped protectively in front of Sarah, his hand moving instinctively to his jacket pocket where he kept the flash drive. Damien Blackwood, you're not quite what I expected, no? And what did you expect? Damien moved closer, flanked by 2 men who had the unmistakable look of professional muscle. Some cartoon villain, perhaps? Someone who would cackle maniacally while explaining my evil plan. I expected someone who was at least half as smart as his father, Marcus replied calmly. But Cornelius never would have been stupid enough to confront me in a public place with witnesses. Damien's smile was sharp as a blade. Witnesses? You mean Sarah? He turned his attention to her, and Marcus felt her shrink back against him. Sarah Martinez, née Chen. Married to Tom Martinez, a contractor who depends on Blackwood Industries for 70% of his business. Mother to Jessica Martinez, age 14, honor roll student at Millbrook High School, and David Martinez, age 11, who has some very expensive medical bills due to his asthma condition. The threat was clear, and Marcus felt Sarah's entire body tense with fear. This was exactly the kind of leverage the Blackwoods had always used, the web of economic dependency and implied violence that kept their victims in line. "Leave them out of this," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your fight is with me." "My fight?" Damien laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "Mr. Thorne, I don't fight with dead men. And that's what you are, you know, a dead man walking. You just don't know it yet." "Is that what you told the reporter 3 years ago?" "Right? Before he had his convenient heart attack?" For the first time, Damien's composure slipped slightly, his eyes narrowing with something that might have been surprise. "You've been doing your homework. I'm impressed. But research and reality are different things, as you're about to discover." One of Damien's men stepped forward, his hand moving inside his jacket, but Marcus was already moving. 27 years of planning had included more than just gathering evidence. He'd also learned skills that the old Marcus had never possessed. The knife appeared in his hand as if by magic, its blade gleaming in the moonlight as he held it at Damien's throat before anyone could react. "Everybody stays very still," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Sarah, get behind the big oak tree, now!" Sarah moved quickly, her footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves as she sought cover. The 2 bodyguards had their weapons drawn now, but they couldn't get a clear shot without risking their employer. "Impressive," Damien said, seemingly unconcerned by the blade at his throat. "But you're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. Even if you kill me right here, right now, what do you think happens next? Do you think my death will somehow bring your father back? Do you think it will undo 27 years of history?" "No," Marcus admitted, "but it will be a start." "Will it?" "Because I think you've made the same mistake that every amateur makes when they decide to play in the big leagues. You think this is about justice. You think this is about right and wrong. But it's not. It's about power. And I have it while you don't." Damien raised his voice slightly, addressing the darkness around them. "Marcus Thorne has something that belongs to me. Something he stole from my family's private files. I'm sure he'll be happy to return it, won't you, Marcus?" The flash drive felt like it was burning a hole in Marcus's pocket. How did Damien know about it? How could he possibly? "You look surprised," Damien continued, reading his expression even in the dim light. "Did you really think you could spend 10 years investigating my family without us noticing? Did you think we wouldn't have people watching you, reporting back on your activities? Marcus, we've known about your little revenge fantasy since the day you hired your first private investigator." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. If they'd known, if they'd been watching, then everything he'd done, every piece of evidence he'd gathered. "It's all worthless, isn't it?" he said, the realization crushing down on him. "Not worthless," Damien corrected. "Carefully curated. You see, we let you find exactly what we wanted you to find. Oh, some of it is real, of course. We're not saints after all. But the really damaging stuff, the evidence that could actually hurt us, that was fed to you through channels we control, and it's all fabricated. Beautiful fabrications, I'll admit, but lies nonetheless." Marcus felt the knife trembling in his hand, 27 years of purpose crumbling to dust around him. "You're lying." "Am I? Think about it. How convenient that you were able to find bank records from 30 years ago. How fortunate that so many former employees were willing to talk for the right price. How remarkable that you were able to piece together such a comprehensive case against us." Damien's voice was gentle now, almost sympathetic. "We've been playing this game for a very long time, Marcus. You're not the first person who thought they could bring us down, and you won't be the last. But my father. Your father was exactly what we said he was. A thief who got caught with his hand in the cookie jar. The only tragedy is that he took the coward's way out instead of facing the consequences of his actions like a man. The rage that filled Marcus then was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It burned through his veins like molten steel, obliterating thought, obliterating caution, obliterating everything except the need to make this man pay for the lies that poured from his mouth. The knife moved before Marcus was even conscious of the decision, slashing across Damien's throat in one smooth motion. But the blade met only empty air. Damien had moved at the last second, stepping back with the fluid grace of someone who had been expecting exactly this reaction. The bodyguards were already moving, their weapons trained on Marcus, but before they could fire, the night exploded with gunshots from a different direction entirely. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, high and desperate. "Marcus, run!" He didn't need to be told twice. Marcus dove behind his father's headstone as bullets chipped away at the marble around him, his mind racing to process what was happening. Someone else was shooting, someone who wasn't part of Damien's crew, and in the confusion, he had a chance to escape. Marcus sprinted through the cemetery, dodging between headstones as more gunshots echoed behind him. He could hear Damien shouting orders, could hear the sound of car doors slamming and engines starting. Whatever was happening, it had disrupted the Blackwood Scion's plans, and Marcus intended to take full advantage of the chaos. He made it to the cemetery's back gate just as a familiar voice called his name. Turning, he saw a figure emerging from behind a mausoleum, and his heart nearly stopped when he recognized who it was. Uncle Ray? Raymond Thorne stepped into the moonlight, a smoking rifle in his hands and a grim smile on his weathered face. Marcus's father's younger brother looked older than his 65 years, his hair completely gray now, his face lined with decades of hard living. But his eyes were sharp and alert, and the way he handled the rifle spoke of military training that had never quite left him. "Hello, nephew," Ray said quietly. "Been a long time." "I thought you were dead," Marcus breathed. "After Dad died, after I left town, I tried to find you, but you couldn't. That's because I didn't want to be found. Cornelius Blackwood made it very clear that anyone who supported your father's version of events would suffer the same fate he did. So I disappeared, went off the grid, waited for my chance." "Your chance for what?" Ray's smile was cold as winter. "To finish what Eddie started, to bring down the family that destroyed ours. And you, nephew, just gave me the perfect opportunity." Behind them, they could hear Damien's men organizing a search, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like angry eyes. Ray grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him toward a break in the cemetery's rear fence. "We need to move," Ray said urgently. "I've got a truck waiting about half a mile through those woods. We can be out of here before they realize what happened." As they ran through the forest, branches tearing at their clothes and undergrowth making every step treacherous, Marcus's mind struggled to process this new development. His uncle, alive after all these years, the mysterious gunman who had saved his life, the implication that Eddie Thorne had been involved in something more complex than a simple embezzlement case. "Uncle Ray," he panted as they jogged through the darkness. "What did you mean when you said Dad had started something?" Ray was quiet for a moment, concentrating on navigating the rough terrain. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps on fallen leaves. "Your father wasn't just a mill worker, Marcus. He was the best damn accountant I ever knew, and he spent the last 2 years of his life documenting every dirty deal, every stolen dollar, every bribed official in the Blackwood organization. He knew they were going to come for him eventually, so he prepared. Prepared how? He hid copies of everything, real evidence, not the fake garbage they've been feeding you for the past 10 years. Bank records, recorded conversations, photographs, witness statements, everything they would need to put the whole family away for the rest of their lives." Marcus stopped running so abruptly that Ray nearly collided with him. "You're telling me that my father had evidence that could have cleared his name, that could have brought down the Blackwoods, and he just, died without using it?" Ray's expression was pained. "He tried to use it, son. The night before he died, he called a meeting with Cornelius Blackwood. He was going to present the evidence, give Cornelius a chance to make things right, maybe work out some kind of deal that would protect the people of this town. And Cornelius had him killed before he could say a word. Made it look like suicide, planted fake evidence to support the embezzlement story, and buried the truth so deep that most people forgot there had ever been another version of events. The weight of this revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His father hadn't been a victim. He'd been a hero, trying to save his community from the very people who eventually destroyed him. And Marcus, in his anger and grief, had spent 27 years planning a revenge that was based on incomplete information. "Where is it?" Marcus asked urgently. "The evidence Dad gathered, where did he hide it?" Ray smiled, and for the first time it looked genuinely happy. "That's the beauty of it, nephew. He didn't hide it somewhere the Blackwoods could find it and destroy it. He hid it somewhere they would never think to look, somewhere they couldn't get to it even if they knew it existed." "Where?" He mailed it to himself. Registered mail, return receipt requested, addressed to Edward J. Thorne at a post office box he rented under a fake name in the next county over. The package was never claimed, so according to postal regulations, it's been sitting in their dead letter office for 27 years, waiting for someone with the proper identification to come pick it up. Marcus stared at his uncle in amazement. "You mean all this time, while I've been chasing shadows and fake evidence, the real proof has been sitting in a post office?" "Not just any post office. The regional sorting facility in Hartwell, about 50 miles from here. I've been checking on it periodically over the years, making sure it's still there, still unclaimed. As of last month it was." They had reached Ray's truck, an old pickup that looked like it had seen better decades but was probably more reliable than it appeared. As they climbed into the cab, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the cold, calculating satisfaction of planned revenge, but genuine hope that justice might actually be possible. "Why didn't you tell me?" Marcus asked as Ray started the engine. "All these years, why didn't you let me know you were alive, let me know about the evidence?" Ray was quiet for a long moment, navigating the dirt road that would take them away from Millbrook and toward whatever came next. "Because I knew what kind of man you'd become," he said finally. "I kept track of you over the years, you know. Read about your business success, your software company, the fortune you built, and I saw the anger in you, the need for revenge that was eating you alive from the inside. So I knew that if I contacted you, if I told you about the evidence, you'd want to charge in guns blazing, ready to take on the whole Blackwood organization by yourself. And that would have gotten you killed, just like it got your father killed." Marcus considered this, recognizing the truth in his uncle's words. The man he'd been a few hours ago, filled with rage and determined to destroy his enemies at any cost, probably would have done exactly that. "What changed?" Marcus asked. "Why contact me now?" Ray smiled grimly. "Because now they know you're here, and they're going to kill you anyway. At this point, we've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. Besides," he added, glancing at his nephew, "you're not the same angry young man who left this town 27 years ago. Tonight, in that cemetery, I saw something I hadn't seen before." "What?" "You protected Sarah Martinez. You could have used her as a human shield, could have sacrificed her to save yourself, but you didn't. You put yourself at risk to keep an innocent person safe. That tells me you've grown up, that you understand the difference between justice and revenge." They drove in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Marcus was trying to process the fact that everything he thought he knew about his father's death was wrong, that the evidence he'd spent a decade gathering was worthless, that his uncle was alive and had been protecting the real truth all this time. It was almost too much to absorb. "Uncle Ray," he said eventually, "what's the plan? Let's say we get this evidence. Let's say it's everything you think it is. What do we do with it? If the Blackwoods own the local police, the local courts, then how do we make sure justice is actually done?" Ray had been thinking about this question for 27 years, and his answer was immediate. "We don't go through local channels. We take it to the FBI, to the state attorney general, to the federal prosecutors who specialize in organized crime. The Blackwoods are big fish in a small pond, but they're still just small fish compared to the federal government." "And you think the federal government will care about a small-town corruption case?" I think they'll care about a small-town corruption case that involves tax evasion, mail fraud, racketeering, and murder, especially when we can prove that the same patterns of behavior have been repeated in other towns, other states. The Blackwoods aren't just a local problem. Marcus, they're part of a larger network of organized crime families who use legitimate businesses to launder money and eliminate competition. This was news to Marcus. How do you know all this? Ray's expression grew grim. Because for the past 27 years I've been doing my own investigation. Not into the Blackwoods specifically, but into the larger organization they're part of. I've traveled across the country, talked to other victims, other families, who have been destroyed by people just like Cornelius and Damien. And what I've found is that it's all connected, a web of corruption that stretches from coast to coast. Jesus, Marcus breathed. So this is bigger than just getting justice for Dad. Much bigger. Your father stumbled onto something huge and they killed him to keep it quiet. But now we have a chance to blow the whole thing wide open, to bring down not just the Blackwoods, but the entire network they're part of. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness ahead of them, illuminating the road that would take them toward Hartwell and the evidence that had been waiting for over a quarter century. Marcus stared out at the passing landscape, his mind reeling from the revelations of the past few hours. Everything he thought he knew about his father's death, about the Blackwood family, about his own quest for revenge, had been turned upside down. There's something else, Ray said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Something I haven't told you about the night your father died. Marcus turned to look at his uncle, seeing the pain etched deep in the older man's weathered features. What is it? Eddie called me that night, about an hour before he was supposed to meet with Cornelius. He was scared, Marcus, really scared. He said he had a feeling something was going to go wrong, that maybe he was walking into a trap. Ray's hands tightened on the steering wheel. I should have stopped him. Should have gone with him or convinced him to take the evidence to the FBI instead of trying to handle it himself. But you didn't know. I knew enough, Ray interrupted, his voice harsh with self-recrimination. I knew the Blackwoods were dangerous, knew they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened them. But your father, he was always too trusting, always believed that people would do the right thing if you just showed them the truth. Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same grief that had driven him for so many years. But now it was mixed with something else, a deeper understanding of the man his father had been. Eddie Thorne hadn't been naive. He'd been hopeful. He'd believed in justice, in the possibility that even corrupt people could be redeemed if confronted with the consequences of their actions. He was a good man, Marcus said simply. The best, Ray agreed. And that's why we're going to finish what he started. Not for revenge, not for our own satisfaction, but because it's what he would have wanted. Justice, not just for him, but for everyone the Blackwoods have heard over the years. They reached Hartwell just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded Marcus of mornings from his childhood, when the world had seemed full of infinite possibility. The regional postal facility was a squat utilitarian building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a chain-link fence and looking more like a warehouse than a government facility. How exactly do we get access to a package that's been sitting here for 27 years? Marcus asked as they parked across the street. Ray reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, worn with age. With these, he said, showing Marcus a collection of documents. Death certificate for Edward J. Thorne, probate court documentation naming me as executor of his estate, and power of attorney forms that give me the legal right to claim any unclaimed mail. You've been planning this for a long time. 27 years, Ray confirmed. I've renewed these documents every few years, kept them current, just waiting for the right moment. And now that moment is here. The postal facility didn't open until 8 a.m., so they had time to grab breakfast at a nearby diner and plan their next moves. Over coffee and eggs, Ray explained the broader scope of what they were dealing with. The Blackwood family is part of what law enforcement calls a hybrid criminal organization, he said, keeping his voice low, even though they were the only customers in the diner at this early hour. They use legitimate businesses as fronts for money laundering, tax evasion, and other white-collar crimes, but they're not afraid to use violence when necessary. Like with the reporter, among others. Over the past 2 decades, at least 6 people who posed a threat to their operations have died under suspicious circumstances. Heart attacks, accidents, suicides, all very convenient, all very difficult to prove were anything other than what they appeared to be. Marcus stirred his coffee thoughtfully. So even if we get this evidence, even if we take it to the FBI, what's to stop them from having us killed before we can testify? Ray smiled, but there was no humor in it. That's where the network comes in. See, I haven't just been investigating the Blackwoods for the past 27 years. I've been building relationships with other victims, other investigators, other families who have been hurt by similar organizations. We've been coordinating our efforts, sharing information, preparing for the day when we'd have enough evidence to bring them all down at once. A coordinated strike. Exactly. If something happens to us, if we disappear or die mysteriously, there are people in 6 different states who will immediately release information that will bring federal attention down on not just the Blackwoods but their entire network. They can silence 1 or 2 people, but they can't silence everyone. At 8 o'clock sharp, they walked into the postal facility. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and the kind of patient demeanor that comes from dealing with bureaucracy for decades. She listened to Ray's explanation, examined his documents with the thoroughness of someone who had seen every possible scam and fraud attempt, and finally nodded. Package addressed to Edward J. Thorne. Post Office Box 247, she said, consulting her computer. Yes, it's here. Been here a long time, according to the records. Usually we destroy unclaimed mail after a certain period. But registered mail with return receipt requested gets special handling. She disappeared into the back of the facility, leaving Marcus and Ray alone with their thoughts and their growing anticipation. When she returned, she was carrying a package wrapped in brown paper, yellowed with age and bearing the distinctive markings of registered mail from nearly 3 decades ago. I'll need you to sign for it, she said, handing Ray a clipboard. Ray's hand trembled slightly as he signed his name, and Marcus understood why. This package represented the culmination of 27 years of pain, investigation, and hope. Inside this innocuous-looking bundle was either the key to justice or just another dead end. They waited until they were back in the truck before opening it. Ray carefully peeled away the aged tape and brown paper, revealing a large manila envelope sealed with wax. Inside the envelope were dozens of documents, photographs, audio cassettes, and what looked like a detailed written narrative in Eddie Thorne's careful handwriting. Marcus picked up the handwritten pages and began to read, his father's voice seeming to speak to him across the decades. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and the truth about the Blackwood family's criminal activities needs to be preserved. I've spent the past 2 years documenting their operations, and what I've found goes far beyond simple embezzlement or tax evasion. The Blackwoods are part of a criminal network that extends across multiple states and involves dozens of legitimate businesses that serve as fronts for money laundering, extortion, and worse. The narrative went on for dozens of pages, detailing financial transactions, recorded conversations, and a web of corruption that was staggering in its scope and complexity. Eddie Thorne had methodically documented every aspect of the Blackwood operation, from their manipulation of local politics to their connections with organized crime families in other states. My God, Marcus breathed as he read. Dad wasn't just an accountant who stumbled onto something. He was conducting a deliberate investigation. Ray nodded grimly. Your father was a lot smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He knew that if he was going to take on an organization like this, he needed bulletproof evidence. And that's what this is, enough documentation to put the entire network in prison for the rest of their lives. Among the documents were bank records showing millions of dollars being funneled through shell companies, photographs of meetings between Cornelius Blackwood and known organized crime figures, and audio recordings of conversations that detailed plans to eliminate business competitors and silence potential witnesses. But the most damning evidence was a detailed accounting ledger that showed exactly how the Blackwood organization operated. They would target small towns with vulnerable economies, move in with promises of jobs and investment, and then systematically take control of local businesses, banks, and government institutions. Once they had control, they would use these legitimate fronts to launder money from their criminal enterprises in larger cities. "This is it," Marcus said, looking up from the documents. "This is enough to bring down not just the Blackwoods, but everyone they're connected with." "Now we just have to make sure it gets into the right hands," Ray replied. He pulled out a cell phone and dialed a number he'd memorized years ago. "Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division. This is Raymond Thorne. I have something you're going to want to see." The irony of the name wasn't lost on Marcus. "Sarah Chen? Is she—" "No relation to your Sarah," Ray said with a slight smile. "Just a coincidence. Agent Chen has been investigating organized crime networks like the Blackwoods for the past 15 years. She's one of the people I've been in contact with, preparing for this day. The meeting was arranged for that afternoon at a federal building in the state capital, 2 hours away." As they drove, Marcus found himself thinking about the events that had led them to this point. His father's death, his own years of exile and false leads, the confrontation in the cemetery, and now this moment when justice might finally be within reach. "Uncle Ray," he said, as they navigated the highway traffic, "what happens after this? Let's say the FBI takes the case. Let's say they arrest the Blackwoods and their associates. What happens to us? What happens to the people in Millbrook who depend on Blackwood Industries for their livelihoods?" It was the same question Sarah Martinez had asked him the night before, and it still troubled him. Justice was important, but so was the welfare of innocent people who would be caught in the crossfire. Ray had been thinking about this too. "The way I see it, we have a responsibility to help rebuild what the Blackwoods destroyed. Your father's evidence doesn't just show their crimes, it also shows where they hid their stolen assets. When those assets are recovered, they can be used to create legitimate businesses, to provide real jobs for people, to give communities like Millbrook a genuine chance at prosperity instead of the fake prosperity the Blackwoods provided. You mean we become part of the solution? Not just the people who exposed the problem." "Exactly. Your father believed in redemption, Marcus. He believed that people could change, that communities could heal, that justice was about more than just punishment. If we're going to honor his memory, we need to think about what comes after the Blackwoods are gone. The federal building was an imposing structure of glass and steel that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered it with less than pure intentions. Agent Sarah Chen met them in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of focused intensity that Marcus recognized in successful business executives. She led them to a secure conference room where 2 other agents waited, along with recording equipment and document scanners. "Mr. Thorne," Agent Chen said as they settled around the conference table, "your uncle has been in contact with our organized crime task force for several years. He's told us about the evidence your father gathered, but we need to see it for ourselves before we can proceed." For the next 4 hours, Marcus and Ray went through the contents of Eddie Thorne's package, explaining the significance of each document, each photograph, each audio recording. The FBI agents asked detailed questions, cross-referenced the information with their own files, and gradually built a picture of the Blackwood organization that was even more extensive than Marcus had imagined. "This is remarkable," Agent Chen said finally, looking up from a stack of financial records. "Your father documented a criminal enterprise that spans 12 states and involves over 50 legitimate businesses. We've been investigating pieces of this network for years, but we've never had evidence that tied it all together. So you can use it?" Marcus asked. "Oh, we can definitely use it. This is enough evidence to launch a coordinated federal investigation involving multiple agencies. We're talking about RICO charges, tax evasion, money laundering, conspiracy, and quite possibly murder charges for several members of the organization." Agent Chen stood up and began pacing, her mind clearly working through the logistics of what would be one of the largest organized crime cases in recent memory. "We'll need to move quickly," she said. "Once we start making arrests, the network will realize what's happening, and they'll try to destroy evidence, flee the country, or eliminate potential witnesses." "What about our safety?" Ray asked. "If the Blackwoods realize that we're the source of this information, you'll be placed in protective custody until the arrests are made," Agent Chen assured him. "We have safe houses, and we have protocols for protecting witnesses in cases like this. But I have to be honest with you, This is going to be dangerous. These people have killed to protect their organization before, and they won't hesitate to do it again. Marcus thought about Sarah Martinez, about her children, about all the innocent people in Millbrook who could be caught in the crossfire if this went wrong. What about the people back home? The ones who don't know anything about this but might be targeted anyway? We'll coordinate with local law enforcement to provide protection for anyone who might be at risk, Agent Chen said. But Mr. Thorne, I need you to understand something. These people are criminals, and they've been getting away with murder for decades. The longer we wait, the more people they're going to hurt. Your father died trying to stop them. Are you prepared to finish what he started? Marcus looked at his uncle, seeing his own determination reflected in the older man's eyes. They had come too far, sacrificed too much. To back down now. We're prepared, Marcus said. The arrests began 3 days later, coordinated across 12 states in a series of dawn raids that swept up over 40 members of the criminal network. Damian Blackwood was taken into custody at the family mansion in Millbrook, along with his security team and several business associates. The raids yielded additional evidence, computers, financial records, weapons, and drugs that confirmed everything Eddie Thorne had documented years earlier. Marcus and Ray watched the news coverage from their safe house, seeing the Blackwood empire crumble on live television. The mansion that had loomed over Millbrook for so many decades was surrounded by federal agents. Its Gothic spires no longer symbols of power, but monuments to the hubris of those who thought they were above the law. Your father would be proud, Ray said quietly as they watched Damian Blackwood being led away in handcuffs. Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions, satisfaction, relief, and something that might have been peace. The anger that had driven him for so many years was finally beginning to fade, replaced by a sense that justice had been served and his father's death had been avenged. But their work wasn't finished. Over the following months, Marcus and Ray testified before grand juries, worked with federal prosecutors to build cases against the network's leadership, and began the complicated process of helping communities recover from decades of criminal exploitation. The Blackwood Industries empire was dissolved, its assets seized and liquidated to provide restitution to victims and fund economic development in the communities that had been damaged. Marcus used his own resources to establish the Edward J. Thorne Foundation, dedicated to helping small towns rebuild their economies with legitimate businesses and transparent governance. A year after the arrests, Marcus returned to Millbrook for the dedication of the new community center, built with recovered Blackwood assets and named in honor of his father. Sarah Martinez was there, along with hundreds of other townspeople who had lived under the shadow of the criminal organization for so long. I owe you an apology, Sarah said as they stood together in the cemetery where everything had begun. That night I was so afraid, so convinced that nothing could change. I didn't believe that justice was possible. Marcus looked down at his father's grave, now marked with a new headstone that identified Eddie Thorne not as a disgraced embezzler, but as a hero who had died fighting corruption. Someone had left fresh flowers, not just on his father's grave, but on dozens of others throughout the cemetery. He would have forgiven you, Marcus said. Dad always believed that people were basically good, that they just needed a chance to do the right thing. And what about you? Sarah asked.
What do you believe now?
Marcus considered the question, thinking about the journey that had brought him from an angry young man seeking revenge to someone who understood that justice was about more than punishment. It was about healing, about redemption, about building something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. I believe my father was right, he said finally. I believe in second chances, in the possibility that even the worst situations can be redeemed if people are willing to do the hard work of building something better. As the sun set over Millbrook, painting the sky in the same golden hues Marcus remembered from his childhood, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 27 years. He felt at home. Not because the town was the same, it wasn't, and never would be, but because he had finally made peace with the past and was ready to help build a better future. The Gothic mansion on the hill still stood, but it was empty now, its windows dark, its power broken. And in the valley below, in the town where his father had lived and died, new businesses were opening, young families were moving in. and hope was taking root in soil that had been poisoned for too long. Marcus Thorne had returned home not as the angry young man who had left, but as someone who understood that the best revenge is not the destruction of your enemies, but the creation of something so much better than what they destroyed, that their crimes become irrelevant footnotes in a larger story of redemption and renewal. His father's work was finally complete, and Marcus's own work, the work of healing and building and growing, was just beginning. The return was over. The redemption had begun. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel for upcoming real-life stories.